Hello, wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Currently, the longest-running show about the DOM on the web
Welcome
today.
to the Web Platform Podcast.
I am one
a developer
of your hosts
discussion
today,
that
Justin
dives
Burrow,
deep into all
hosting with
things
me
web. We
as
discuss
usual,
topics
Danny
relevant
Blue,
to developing
Hey, everybody.
the modern web
and Leon
and the
Revill.
web platform of today,
Hello, everyone.
tomorrow,
And
beyond.
today's episode is brought to you by the Web Components Remote Conf, because sometimes you need to know more about web components. So, to that end, we have a wonderful guest for you today, Jordan Last. Everybody, welcome Jordan to the show.
Hello. Good to be here.
Jordan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so let's see. I'm still in college, about to graduate in April. I grew up kind of near the Silicon Valley. My dad's an electrical engineer, which made me really excited about software, I guess. I love JavaScript. I love web components. It's just the best experience I've had so far with developing GUI applications. And so, yeah, I'm at a startup right now. Everything we're pretty much doing full stack web components. So our front end is web components, our back end is web components, everything.
Full stack web components, that's
Yeah.
crazy. I've been told you can't do that.
You can. Well, we can at least. I think we're the only people doing it in the world. So
you're going to be
see how it
doing
turns out.
you're going to be delivering a talk for Web Components Remote Conference on that specifically. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much.
Cool. So could you?
So I mean, servers. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just see if you can tell us a little bit about web components on the back end, full stack, universal web components. Kind of what is that? It sounds crazy. So please enlighten us.
Yeah. So let's see. I started off doing. I think the first time I did GUIs was using like Java Swing, which was pretty imperative, and it got super complicated as the GUI got more and more complex. Then I went to kind of webby ASP.NET type stuff. It was still kind of weird for me. Finally, Angular started to come around, and that was like, oh wow, this makes sense now. I especially liked how you could pretty much make custom elements with directives. That was nice. And I started to realize, oh, this custom element thing is really, really awesome for, I don't know, just managing the complexity, exposing it simply and declaratively. It just made things very easy it kind of made it easy to understand the entire application kind of at a higher level, I guess. So that was going well for a while, just using custom elements to build normal web or mobile applications. Then one time I was listening to a podcast, and I can't, to this day, I can't find that exact podcast I listened to, but someone mentioned like, oh, you could use components, web components on the server. Maybe they weren't meaning what I thought they were meaning, but I thought, oh my goodness, could you make a custom element that was for like an Express application? Like, could I make a custom element that was a middleware or any other kind of thing like that? And started thinking, how is it possible? How would you even do that? And like you'd need to hook the component into Node.js somehow. So, can you do? Oh, Electron potentially could do that because has Chromium, has Node.js. Maybe I could just write the custom element, all the HTML stuff using Chromium. It will render it, but when it renders, it will actually call the JavaScript, which is calling Node.js. So I thought about it a lot, and I thought I think it's possible. So. And that was on like a long trip across Nevada that I was like thinking about that. So I thought a lot about it, and I thought, I think it's possible. So I went home and pretty much just started a project called Scram Engine. Not very complex, but it lets you feed index.html, just any HTML file into Electron, and boom, it will just go and start it up for you. And it worked nicely. So my first experiment was building Express web components just to see if I could get Express applications to work. And at first I was thinking, yeah, just server side. Like, it'd be cool to use these things server side. And those work pretty well for us, at least. I think I pretty much have the entire API covered with there's like 4 or 5 basic components. And we have a pretty small API server that we're running at the startup right now, but it's running in production. And all of our routes and stuff are done with custom elements. It makes it really nice to just, take entire logical pieces of the app and make a component for it, stick it in. And routing is really easy because you just nest your elements as children of like an express router element. And it's cool because our front end and our back end are structured exactly the same way. So even if there are guys working on the front end, they can go to the back end and they're like, oh, this is just Polymer, custom elements. It's easy for them to look around. So That's cool. That's been working well for us. And then just a month or 2 ago, I was talking with my roommate at night, talking about the future. And somehow it came up like, what if we could use web components to build hardware? I was like, can you do that? Oh, yeah, I think you could. If we can hook into Node.js, I know that there's Node.js robotics libraries out there and things for working with Raspberry Pis or Edisons and Galileos and Arduinos and things like that. And I thought that's probably possible too. And I've been experimenting and it works. I've got an LED component that works. You just tell it the GPIO number. You can turn it on and off. I've got a motor component I'm working on. For the talk, I'm going to try to build a quadcopter.
Wow.
And I've already got the code pretty much written. I just have to get the custom elements actually implemented. But yeah, it's working. And I think the custom elements, the benefits that you get from custom elements, just that high level declarative view, kind of that visual hierarchy, I really think that it's extremely useful in all kinds of user interface applications, not just graphical user interfaces.
Cool.
So
that sounds really awesome. I think, very much looking forward to the talk. And so just to take a step back a little bit, for anybody who doesn't know what Web Components Remote Conference is, it's a conference next month, February the 16th to 17th, a remote conference. So if you purchase a ticket, you'll be able to get access to both days with 16 talks, Jordan's been one of them. Tickets are currently only $20, so it's an absolute steal. So, if you haven't already got a ticket, go to wcremoteconf.com and grab one. And Jordan's talk is going to be one of the awesome talks there over those couple of days. So just wanted to inform everybody exactly what we're talking about here. So yeah, very much looking forward to that talk.
Yeah, and pretty much everybody on this call right now is actually working on that conference, trying very hard to make sure everything is working according to plan. So support is always appreciated, and we've got a great lineup for you indeed. Now, Jordan, I lost you after you mentioned the words Java Swing. At that point, I just blacked out during that conversation. Do they still teach Java Swing? Like, is that a thing? I'm so scared right now for people.
In 2000, it was 2013. So I think all my classes, they don't teach that anymore, but it was a good learning experience. They taught me character.
Perseverance.
That is always good. Where at the very least, like it was character building. It was a character building experience.
Yeah.
But no, that's using web. You're talking about robotics. I think that's ways that people have never. I mean, at least I've never thought about, using web components in that way. But when you think about them, when you are just using them as a declarative interface for an underlying JavaScript API of some sort, it really doesn't seem. So when you first say it, you're like, that sounds ridiculous. That's not going to work. Yeah. But then when you do start to break it down into smaller chunks, like you were talking about, you're like, well, it does. There's no reason that a lot of this stuff doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think it's really important because, I mean, if you think about HTML, it has lowered the barrier to entry for building web-based applications or, just websites in general to tons of people. Like there's people who aren't programmers necessarily who can understand HTML and can build things. So, if we can get rid of all the crazy C and C++ as much as possible, and give people a nice HTML way of building things, I feel like it could be very powerful.
Yeah, that's the powerful thing about web components is being able to create a segment of code which is easily reusable, that's got tons of really good functionality in it, really performant and kind of nice to use, and then people that aren't particularly experienced can just drop that functionality in and it's good to go. That's kind of one of the really key things for me for web components.
The barrier to entry is very low. I think that's, key. I mean, there's so many people getting into sort of the development sphere of things today, and if we can lower the barrier to entry to learn sort of the tooling that exists on there, on standards compliant tooling to boot. This is a thing that for a long time didn't exist. I mean, standards was the thing that was too far away, and you needed lots of shims and polyfills, and it was very complicated. But if we can lower that barrier, I think, this web thing just might work.
Yeah. The future is web.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. So kind of on that note, web components is, it's been a thing for quite a while now, but kind of why is now the right time to really start caring about web components? I'm going to lead that question to Justin here, because I think he's got a cracking answer. Why should everybody really start thinking about web components? Why is web components remote conference important? Why is learning about web components important? Why is it important now?
I think the V1 specs have really sort of started to solidify what we can do on sort of with web components. I mean, there were so many contentious bits over the time, and I know that Danny and I have, argued about Shadow DOM for, I don't know how many times over the course of what was V0.
Yeah, it's only been about a 2 or 3 year argument. It's fine.
and now, it looks, the browser vendors have sort of come together, and last year was sort of a big year in that, where so many of those face-to-face meetings occurred that consensus was had, and consensus really leads to something that developers can get on board with. I mean, yes, it took a long time coming. I think that was one of the major qualms that a lot of folks had when it came to web components as a whole, that, it was 5 years in the making, and it's missing this and it's missing that, and but look just how much power we have now. I mean, you look at custom elements v1, I see a lot of custom elements happen. You've got webcomponents.org that relaunched with a lot of stuff that's being written by the community as a whole, not just by major organizations who, are, fully invested in web components. Now you've got all kinds of developers writing those components, and a very easy way to test and play with them, no less. I mean, if you haven't tried the new webcomponents.org, I highly recommend you do. There's some great stuff there. So there's a lot of things that are sort of happening now around web components. I mean, custom elements API within V1 has a wonderful syntax. It's very easy to write in JavaScript if you want to write newer JavaScript. You've got really slim polyfills. So if you just want to polyfill out the custom elements API, it's easy to do. There's just a lot of action now that has sort of been propelled forward. And then that's not even counting all the additional libraries and things that are being built on top of those specs. So you have things like Polymer, Skate, so many, just sugary goodness that makes life easier from a development standpoint. And then the interoperability story is huge, right? With web components, you're building on standards, you can use them within other frameworks. These are, so many of the reasons. And now is a great time to start to learn to see how those things can be applied in projects that you currently have, or even a greenfield project you're working on.
Yeah. I mean, even frameworks that are out there that aren't built on top of web components directly, a lot of times you can see the influence of them as trying to get people building components in a certain way. I think if you look at parts of Angular 2, if you look at parts of, a lot of Vue.js as well, and they actually talk, and I believe I've said that before, probably several times, that in their documentation, they specify several places where they say, this looks an awful lot like a web component. In Angular 2, you can change the view encapsulation mode to use the native Shadow DOM if you're using your component scoped styles. Right now in Angular 2, they make very heavy use of the template tag, which is part of that web component spec. So that's probably one of the easier ones to see, is that they do Angular-y stuff with it, but they do use the template tag.
Yeah, it just goes to show that a lot of these frameworks are kind of lending from these, kind of core technologies, which is really good to see. And I think one of the key things is the fact that, people can now see that a spec has been decided upon, browser vendors are adapting all these different specifications. So people are less frightened about adopting this new technology because it's obvious that it's here to stay and it's going to change how we build things.
Yeah, and I think that, as we sort of move forward with it, this is not, V1's not going to magically change tomorrow. It's going to break all your things. I mean, this is key to point out. V1 is here. Like, this is a thing that people are building on. Browser vendors are going to ship things. Yay for us as developers. So, you're not looking for, interoperability. Like, interoperability is a big deal for me personally, because I work on a lot of legacy stuff. You try to bring them up to date. You need interop. And, a web component has its API that I can call with JavaScript in all kinds of different ways. And I can define those things as I need with that sort of encapsulation and bring things into the future while still trying to wedge them into places that you wouldn't think they would go. Which is why, talking to Jordan is so interesting, right? Because you're putting them on the server, you're putting them on hardware. These are interesting places for them to go.
Well, my mind is still a little bit blown about web component robots. So I just want you so Jordan, I just want you to know that you've broken my brain for the day as I try to wrap my hand around it exactly. But it's very cool.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'm very much so looking forward to your talk next month.
We've kind of talked about why web components are, the bee's knees. Is that an old term? I feel like that's like I've been watching a lot of older films lately. I feel like, my vocabulary has shifted significantly.
It sounds very British.
Well, me, I'm the most, American Portuguese sort of person, British, that you can possibly be.
Wait, so hold on. So for something that has nothing to do with web components at all, do you guys get the game show network of any kind? Like not like new ones. I don't remember what.
Yeah, ancient. It's old game shows, right?
It's fantastic. It's like one of my favorite things. So like I don't have cable, but I have one of those little antennas, and there's a bunch of really weird channels you get, and one of them is this game show channel, and you just watch episodes of The Price is Right from the 70s, and it's amazing. Just in talking about the bee's knees made me think of that. But so for anybody that hasn't ever looked at that, you should try to find it. It's fascinating.
Sometimes you have to look to the past to understand the future, I think is the key. And this is how I'm going to pivot this back into web components, because for a long time we did not have web components on the web. The 70s, it was a very dark time for the web, literally. But with so much of the sort of shift that we've seen, obviously, stability-wise, we have specs that are pretty stable now that are being implemented. Browser support-wise, we have polyfills that are fairly small. If you discount the Shadow DOM one, which, let's not use that for the most part. It kind of chugs on mobile, which we all pretty much know at this point. If you don't, definitely look at the repo. But there's also now with all these things sort of emotion, like are web components in production today? That's a question I know I get at a lot of talks. I know y'all get it at a lot of talks as well. Are you guys using, components in production today?
Yes.
Yeah, we certainly do. And I suppose the biggest challenge for a lot of people is when you kind of talk about web components in production, it's IE11. IE11 has still got a lot of users for a lot of different industries, and that's always a problematic one because obviously you got Shadow DOM in iOS now, and Safari.
Custom elements in Safari, I think, are in the preview.
Yeah,
right?
I think so too. So
official release, but they're coming very soon.
So pretty soon, the only kind of platform that's going to be a big problem for people is IE11. So obviously, you've got a lot of things to consider there. But I've seen it being done time and time again. We use IE11. We support IE11 at work with vanilla JavaScript web components, utilizing the polyfills. So yeah, totally.
Hey, I have a question for you, Leon. Are you using them in production for mobile applications?
Yes. Yes, we are, definitely, yes. I was just thinking how IE11 kind of on mobile kind of.
That's the only browser I run on my mobile device.
Well, very much crazy, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the mobile support generally, obviously, a lot of the older Android devices aren't going to support it, but you know, the newer Android devices greater than 4.4, you know, good support with the polyfills, work quite nicely. Yeah, so.
And so is that oh
No,
sorry.
go ahead.
Is that using, like, are you building actual like applications like with Cordova, or?
Yeah, so we build a lot of hybrid applications. So again, it's just a set of web assets in a web view, and it's just we currently just use vanilla web components, so we don't utilize Polymer or any other kind of libraries, which obviously do work nicely across all the different platforms anyway.
Yeah, cool. Okay.
Yeah, so I was going to ask about we were talking about browser support a little bit. So we know that Chrome has it, so we know that mobile Chrome has it on Android because I know we've said before, Chrome on iOS is not Chrome; it's WebKit still. So until WebKit has custom elements and the other specs, it will not be there. My question is about the Android native browser. If anybody knows anything about that, because I actually so I just got a Galaxy S7 and was really surprised to see that that it still comes pre-installed with just, I believe, what Samsung calls internet. So does anybody know about the native browser?
Well, that's Samsung's internet browser. So that's based on that's based on Chrome. So it has a changelog that's available. It has Service Worker and pretty much most of the current specs. They have some different. I think there are some differences within it, but that is based on Chrome. So you're not. This is because this is a key difference, right? We're not. Samsung's fairly up to date, and they're in a lot of those conversations. Like if you're on Twitter or on the mailing list or whatever, you see them talking quite a bit about things, which is kudos to them, by the way. But the key is that we're not talking about old Android with internet, which the browser that was on old Android, which if you ever had to deal with it at sort of well, actually any capacity, your results would greatly vary. In terms of performance of anything, really. It was not exactly the greatest experience in terms of web development or users actually using the internet. So that's not the same thing, not the same browser. And then, internal native and on Android is still a Chrome view, which updates independently of the Android OS. You can get it from Play Store.
Yeah, so for a while now, the Android web view has been essentially Chrome anyway. So it's really old devices where you had the problem. I can't remember the exact version numbers, but generally nowadays it's all good. Yeah,
anything sub 4.2.
I think so. Yeah,
I think it sounds right. My memory doesn't fail me. But yeah, I mean, but then again, so I mean, it's also going to depend on where you're deploying, right? I mean, we're talking about Android right now. Like we have tablets that are custom made that run all kinds of crazy stuff, and those are special cases. They're little snowflakes in your daily development life that make you question why snowflakes exist. Because it's very hard to target those sorts of things. You really do have to do quite a bit of testing. I have sub IE11 stuff that, IE7, 6 is almost dead. 7 I still have existing. Those are sad days. Those are sad days for Justin.
Oh, good Lord.
Web components don't work.
No, they don't. A lot
most
of
other
stuff
things
don't
work.
JavaScript barely works.
This is true, but those are smaller slivers of time in the scope of web development, and I don't think that's as great a problem today. But IE11 this is true. Like IE11, definitely look at your user stats if you're rolling out into prod. We use them in prod too. Like I love all the things, and we've had pretty solid results, even on internal apps that are kind of browser scattered, where they're not. A little bit of Chrome, a little bit of Firefox. And these days, a lot more Edge, sort of in those environments. And Edge is working on all kinds of specs too. So, yay!
I've got a question for Jordan. In your kind of experiments with the kind of hardware side of stuff, do you have to deal with polyfills at all, or is that kind of just not part of the picture because of the environment you're in?
So far, I'm using Electron as the environment for everything. So pretty much have full support for what I need. And I'm writing the components in Polymer. But Electron is pretty heavyweight on like the memory side. So to get these web components working in lower power devices like microcontrollers, yes, it's going to be a much bigger challenge because I don't think we can use Electron. Some of these devices, they're barely trying to get Node.js to run on them. So there is a project called JS DOM that is like a JavaScript DOM implementation that doesn't have web components built into it yet. You'd have to write the implementation in JavaScript to get that to work. So
you could just do that in a weekend, right?
Yeah. So that's a project that I'm looking at, and I think it'd be fun to try to implement custom elements, but sounds kind of scary. So yeah, but currently, like for server-side web components, or if you're doing anything with like a Raspberry Pi or a Intel Edison, these high-powered devices, then Electron makes it really nice because you don't need any polyfills or anything. For the V0 specs, at least. I don't think they have the V1 specs yet because I think Chromium's still behind in the latest Electron release.
Okay.
The Electron folks, who I know I've talked to a few of them over the year. I saw some of them at Chrome Dev this year. My hat's off to them because they do some pretty cool work overall to make things work. So if you haven't looked at Electron, we'll put a link in the show notes, but it's a very cool piece of software. You've probably used Electron and simply not known it.
Slack, for example, I think is an Electron-based application. So most people have used Slack in this industry, I imagine.
Or if you've used Atom.
Yeah.
Are people using Atom? Is that a thing?
No.
Legitimate question. I don't know.
No, it's still. I mean, if that's serious, yes, then it's still pretty huge.
Sorry, I'm not really up to date with the editors. As long as I can just open something and type, I'm generally fairly happy. IntelliSense, nice add-on.
Do you do all your IE7 development in Notepad?
That's the only way legally you're allowed to work on IE7 work now. This is a law that was passed. No, you don't get tabs. There are no tabs.
Oh, dear.
Oh man, I remember Notepad++ was the first editor of any kind I used after Dreamweaver.
Oh man, no. So I got you beat. So the one that we had to use in college was Pico.
I don't know what that is. Sounds old.
Which if you remember Pico, Nano is kind of like that now. But I don't. And the funny thing is that I don't know why they didn't mandate VI. But whatever. It's fine. Pico.
Not better about this at all. I haven't been harboring a grudge for the past 20 years. It's fine. I have no idea how long ago this was. I have very little concept of time as far as
this is the late 90s-ish, 97-ish.
Okay.
So, 96, 97, I don't know.
Yeah.
It was a go. I'm going to leave the proper, descriptor off that one. Just a go.
Yeah.
So we've talked about web components in production a little bit. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about kind of web component challenges. Like, what are the main challenges that people are faced when kind of using web components today? Some of those challenges might be styling or sharing resources and those kind of things. Obviously, one of the great benefits of web components is the shadow DOM. So you've got the encapsulation, so you can have complete control over how your component looks and feels when somebody else uses it. But of course, when somebody uses one of your components, you also want them to be able to theme it in some way so it looks like the rest of their application. So obviously that I get a lot of questions about, well, kind of how do you do that? So has any of you guys got any experience in that kind of area?
So I have one that's not tied to styling, but it's actually a little bit simpler than that. But it's just overall how you get your element to start rendering DOM at all. Because you have your so it's really easy at the beginning, and a lot of example code that I've shown, you pretty much just write a little render function, and then after you set a property, you just set inner HTML, which works for really small things, and a lot of times that's just kind of how it gets left. What gets weird is then it's like, okay, well, this is not going to scale. I'm not going to be able to do this exactly this way. It's then decided, it's like, well, how can I do, especially people coming from React, coming from any framework that has a component architecture of any sort. So coming from React, from Angular, any of that kind of stuff. Because the template tag doesn't do much. It actually, by design, doesn't do anything. Which is, so for anybody that's not familiar, it just lets you put an inert piece of DOM on the page. Think of it as a non-hacky way, instead of putting script type equals my template thing. You then take it, clone it, and do whatever you want with it there. But there's not like a built-in way to handle a lot of the templating stuff that people want to do. Now, I think Skate.js uses Google's incremental DOM for its templating, I believe. I know there have been people that have been doing a lot of stuff using very small React-like libraries like Preact as the actual template of their custom elements. So there's some things like that going on. But so that's actually a very basic one that becomes not super easy to explain, because when you start saying, oh, you can build any application you want using just web components, and then there are these very basic things that people expect from frameworks the web components don't provide. So that is one thing that is there that isn't. It's not that it's not solved, but it's not the most straightforward answer.
Yeah. So you're talking about things like, so you've stamped the initial DOM with your component, but then you want to be able to easily update the contents of it, change what happened based on kind of what's happened with the component, that kind of stuff, where, in Angular JS, at least, you just use some curly brackets and off you go. It's all done for you with data binding. And then in React, obviously, you've got those kind of different things. And of course, you don't get that with vanilla web components, at least. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So especially people that are coming from, so that's one of the things like Polymer, that's one of the things that Polymer does for you, is it uses it has its own template binding engine in it. So that's something that if you're just using vanilla web components based on what you're doing, is something you have to find a solution that works for you.
Yeah, I think challenge-wise, when it comes to web components, I think one of the key things is to actually figure out what a component is. To Danny's point, like there's, realistically, there are a few specs involved with this, right? You've got the template API spec, which is really useful, even if you don't use the other ones. You have got the custom elements API spec, you got Shadow DOM. The thing that you don't hear a lot about anymore is HTML imports, because there is some contention around that, particularly within, the ES world of like, how are we going to do modules and do that importing? So that's one of the more, I hesitate to use the word easy, but let's just say easy for lack of a better term at the moment, things that you can at least polyfill in terms of imports at a very high level. But figuring out how those things weave together to actually build a component can be challenging for people who have never actually built components before. This leads to a lot of concepts around, how do I design my components API? How do my get and set work for things internal to it? What's my, how do I shuffle state around if I'm going to shuffle state? I see a lot of, when I go out and give talks, I get that kind of question of like, well, I don't understand how, even at a very high level, how a component works. And I'm curious, I mean, do you all see that as well, where people are like, I don't know how to design like this unit of functionality that goes into my thing? Because I see it, I keep hearing it, and it's one of those things that I've decided I'm going to have to get to talk about.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's even it's even a little bit worse than that, perhaps, because you go away and you tell people web components are awesome, go and learn how to do them, and they go to the web and they Google, building web components. There's very little amount of actual resource there for them to learn about it, and especially when they come across articles and things using kind of v0 specifications. So yeah, there's those challenges. Is kind of, how am I supposed to kind of build this thing? What is a component? What specs should I use? But also generally, just right at the very beginning, kind of, how do you even get started? I think we, as a community, we need to write a lot more content with a lot more up to date using the latest specs and stuff like that as well, to really help people out in this way.
So me personally, I haven't seen some of that as much. Like, there's the whole getting started, which API should I use, that kind of stuff. But the fact that most of the I guess the front end frameworks of the now, or frameworks and libraries or whatever, have some sort of a component structure at its base. The core building block in Angular 2, right after the module, is the component. The core building block of React and Preact and all that stuff is some sort of a component. So I feel like, at least in my experience, people are just starting to get more comfortable with the idea of breaking up an application into components versus strictly into views, which I think is where I think a lot of people came from originally. But I do agree with Leon, where there's still this. It's a hard problem to just Google right now, because if you don't know anything, you run across v0 stuff, and then you're like, well, this doesn't make sense with the talk that I just listened to. So I know whenever I do write or give a talk about web components, I always go over the difference between v0 and v1 and show like the most basic example, like the names. The simplest thing is, if it says document.register element, don't use that one anymore. If it says window.define, window.custom elements.define, you can use that one.
Yeah.
And going off what Danny said, I feel like usually people coming on to my team who are new to web components, if we sit down, they understand. Usually I feel like they're coming from, I've worked with maybe Angular before or something. But if we explain that it's just properties go in and events come up, and that's pretty much the only way that you interact with your component, then I feel like they usually get that pretty well. Especially if I say no two-way data binding, then that helps as well.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have to make choices, though, right? Like that, right? So you're like, we're not doing two-way data binding. Like, this is
then you have to kind of explain what that is and why, which I guess gets a little complicated. But
and I think that's okay, though. But I think that's the API designer's goal. Like, I think that's this is one of those cool things that I just love about the whole concept around custom elements, is that I can sit there and define out very specific API that just does what I need this one thing to do. Like, if I want to Unix principle this thing, into oblivion, you're going to do one thing, and that's the only thing you're going to do. Like, if I make sed as a web component, wow, did you make? I don't see now. I got that goes on the list.
Oh no,
Sed
I was
as
going
a
to say. Oh no! Based on our other conversations, technically you should be able to write command line tool with web components, right?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, seriously. Hook node into the C++ bindings and then call system call or something.
Oh, that's it? No, that's fine. No, that's really cool though. I wonder if anybody. All right, sorry.
We're just coming up with all kinds of good ideas today.
Well, at least good ideas for now.
Yeah, until it's 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm going, where did I come? Why am I working on this?
How did I make this happen? How did I get this far into this?
I write my best APIs at 1 a.m. Like, that's when the good ideas start coming. The names get weird, but the good ideas structurally.
Why is this variable called FML3? But so actually, I think a lot of the stuff that we're talking about now is one of the other reasons that the web components remote conf is important. So Jordan, you just talked about no two-way data binding. We're going to do data in through properties and then bubble up events to manage whatever we're going to manage. And I believe there are actually multiple talks on that. I know I'm giving one kind of with using RxJS, and then I think there's another one that's just very focused on keeping these dumb components that don't manage their own state and things like that. But so having a conference that is focused on this one concept, because there is a lot of stuff there. It's okay, it's like, okay, I've made it print hello world to the screen. Awesome. Now I have to do other stuff. So showing more examples, and the to-do examples and things like that are always, like they don't cover everything that you really need to know, but especially if most people know how to implement a to-do list in their framework or library of choice. And then being able to show that same thing written in something else, it's easier to translate exactly what's going on. I think it also helps that you can use some of the concepts that that a lot of people are finding very useful, like for the most part, your components not managing state for the most part, right? They just render what they're given, and then if an event happens, you emit custom events for that. Custom events is actually one of the other parts. It is not part of the web components spec, but I think it should always be included in the conversation when we are talking about it. So custom event, for a long time, you could say new event and do click or something like that. You have to be able to create a custom event to pass data with that event. There's a property called detail on custom events that let you pass whatever you want. So if you have a web component, if you're familiar with Angular, 2 and up, if you think about how you interact with events and things there, it's very, very similar to when you're writing web components. You have information coming into a property, and then when something changes, say like, okay, this has been selected, you can dispatch a custom event and show what and pass whatever information you need to in it. So custom events is another important one, and I know it is being brought up in one of the talks for next month.
To Danny's point, yeah, I think that's, as we start to work with the APIs, and you're starting to see a lot more of that happen now. Again, webcomponents.org, for those who haven't looked, where a lot of that conversation and those sort of approaches are starting to occur. And at the remote conf, ideally, we're going to hear a lot of perspectives. And the more perspectives we have, it can better inform us as, architects of software. I think this is one thing that a lot of people sort of downplay, because it's not, to some extent, it's about how you want to approach it and what's good for your team. Because a lot of, I got this question the other day, which was, I want the platform and all the things to do everything for me. Like, why doesn't it do this and why doesn't it do that? And I think I've said this on the podcast before, but I often say it is your job to write code and engineer things. And if we can inform everybody's, about things that are happening in the world with different approaches, that hopefully gives you some leap point to start making your own choices and decisions and components and do those sorts of things. Because my way is not, Leon's way is not Danny's way, is not Jordan's way. And that's okay. Like, everyone has to make architectural decisions and design choices.
Which is why Java Swing was such a great experience for me, because it showed me a lot of ways I don't necessarily want to do things. It just gave me a lot of good perspective.
Anyways. It was supposed to change the world, and it did.
It did.
Just not in the way everyone thought it was going to change the world.
Well, there was also, there have been components for the web for a long time in some sort. So there was even GWT, right? Google Web Toolkit, which was, you wrote, I believe that's correct, isn't it? Where you actually wrote Java components in a markup language.
Was that JS Forms or JWT?
No, GWT, Google Web Toolkit.
Oh, okay.
That's right, Justin, isn't it?
Yeah, Gwt. Yep. Yeah, you could write in Java. They had Java components that translated into web stuff. IE had components, way back when. Yeah, IE had What were they called? I've drawn a blank right now, but yeah, IE technically had components. I want to say in 4 or 5, if I remember correctly. So I mean, again, components are not a new idea. I mean, a lot of people too might be confused and say, I don't understand web components. Why do they exist? Well, the web is kind of behind in that regard, which is why it took a long time to get components in, because components have been around in software for a long time. CBI, component-based, or design and that sort of thing. That's been a thing for as long as I can remember. Different platforms have always had different component toolkits. I mean, if you look at your typical SDK today, for most of your major, operating system platforms, they have, sort of components that you can throw together and build apps with. You're not implementing the same sort of things that we would do for the web. And now that the web has components, you can sort of gain some of those not necessarily native-ish features, but you get the componentization to be able to do unique things that you want them to do. And that's a lot of power, even if there are challenges. I mean, obviously, we still have styling challenges. There's been some great work lately around that with CSS variables and everything else. You've got, the resource share problem too, which I know is in our doc. How do you share methods? How do you share, things like icons? Those are challenges. Polymer has behaviors, and, you can extend to some extent within the custom elements API off of existing element things. I think that's right in V1, if I got it right still.
Yep.
Which point, sorry, I'm sitting here, to Danny's point, I'm comparing them in my head. What was in V0 and which one was in V1 and what got sliced out of the thing? Which is why we have a conference, to talk about these things so that we can all make sure our memories are correct.
Yeah, and hopefully come up with some answers to some of the obvious kind of challenges and stuff people have as well. That should be good to see.
Yeah. One other thing that I want to point out, I know we're starting to run into our hour. So we have talked about collecting thoughts. We've talked about all the kind of weird different stuff you can do with web components, and I wanted to throw another one on top there. But if anybody's heard of A-Frame, which is actually using custom elements to build VR. To build VR scenes. So like you can actually, if you go to, I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but you look at some of the code for, like they're really simple, like here is a VR scene that you can use, and you click view source. There's no JavaScript that you are writing. You create a sphere, a box, set some position stuff, and that is it. It is all in markup. Things like that are really, really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's a Mozilla project, correct?
I believe so. Yes. I haven't looked into it. For a while. I actually even remember. I think it was. I think Tim Sweeney had originally started talking about. I became aware of it because Tim Sweeney, for anybody that doesn't know, is a very famous programmer who used to work for id Software. With John Carmack back in the day, and he created the Unreal Engine. But he was talking about WebVR of some sort and talking about needing a declarative thing. And in that thread, somebody was like, A-Frame. And it was one of those other things where it's like, yeah, custom elements going in there, solving a problem. But it is pretty cool. It's a very, very cool thing to check out, and does show how simple, complicated things can become to write out.
No, it's again, right? We lower the barrier to entry. You get more people to, want to build stuff on the web, and that's, for me, that always has a spot in my heart. Personally, Justin hearts the web. This is a thing. So we've covered a lot of web component-y style of things and whatnot. What have we not talked about that we have just totally ignored today so far?
I don't know. We've talked about a lot of stuff. We did not dig into styling that much. I know Leon mentioned it, and then I sidetracked onto something else. But it was brought up. Styling is still a thing that is at the same part of the, like actually creating your presentation layer, because you don't have to use Shadow DOM with web components.
Blasphemy, sir.
For the most part, I don't use Shadow DOM when I create when I create web components. I've messed around with it, and you can also see how it's still kind of a challenge for theming, because Shadow DOM does encapsulate everything, which is great until you would like into it, please. And there used to be some really straightforward APIs for tapping into that Shadow DOM with like /deep, and there were others before that, but those I believe are all gone now. They're no longer part of the spec. They might still work in older implementations, and I believe
they died.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, it's all gone, right?
No, deep and don't. If you see those anywhere, take them out now. Like, don't do those things.
That is actually one thing that I believe. So, Angular uses has a shady DOM shim, very similar to what Polymer uses, based on my understanding. I don't know the inner workings of them, but they look like they're very similar. They still have the deep keyword in there that you can use, and whenever it comes up in a thread, I was just like, you shouldn't use this, because as soon as you switch from the default, which is emulated, to native, it's not going to work. So that's one thing that is there, that is no longer there, and I believe it's gone for mostly performance reasons. It pretty much became like a really, really like sledgehammer of an important.
Yeah, it was not particularly performant. If you read the mailing list, or at least on the Chrome side where it was in use, like it was for a while, you probably saw it if you were running older, like really old versions of Polymer, where the console would warn you straight up. Like, Chrome was like, no, don't stop using this now. It is deprecated and will die. Like, just don't do that. And within V1, like V1 has, override and things like that, where the outside takes over so that you can do nicer things within the theming sort of world of things. Yeah. There's been some better pieces on styling that have sort of come out in terms of, and Polymer gives you shared styles, which are convenient, across components if you're, working within a core application. But that story, again, this is one of those things that we as developers who build components and release them publicly need to sort of work on.
Yeah, so what we do have is custom CSS properties, which don't solve all the problems, but it does mean that you can basically create a styling API for your component. So if you're using custom CSS properties inside your Shadow DOM, you can basically, expose maybe like a primary color or a secondary color or background color or other things that you would want a user of your component to style. With those in your component, they can then go ahead and override those particular CSS properties and change the inner workings of your component, which works quite nicely. Like I said, it doesn't solve all the problems. There's still, a few things to kind of figure out with the styling with web components. But that's a kind of a nice start and solves a lot of the problems that people have with Shadow DOM styling initially.
And those custom properties, or also they're called custom properties or CSS variables, kind of depending on where you're looking. And I'm actually looking at the Can I Use chart right now. They're in Chrome, they're in Firefox, they're in Safari 10, in mobile Safari and Chrome for Android and Android browser. It looks like they are not in IE 11, but partial support for Edge 15. So that is also something that's coming up that you should be able to use, because those are just cool in general. We could actually probably talk a lot more about those, but they do play nicely with some of those ideas in with web components.
And you can actually get CSS custom properties working in regards to the Shadow DOM styling if you're using the shady CSS polyfill. Obviously, there's performance implications to doing that, but it does mean you can write and use those across all the different platforms.
And shady works okay. I mean, perf-wise on stuff that doesn't, have current support.
That is something we actually should point out, because Justin said something about it was the full Shadow DOM polyfill is the one that was that was very difficult to do. It was big, and it's actually kind of amazing that it worked at all.
It was an engineering marvel.
yeah.
Kudos to the people who wrote it, because that was epic.
But it was not very performant. The Shady DOM shim that Polymer and, again, very similarly that Angular use, it's not that. It is different. It's not full encapsulation. But if you are in their playground, things don't leak out. So like, for example, a really easy example to show you of the difference is that if you have a Polymer component on the page that is using some encapsulated styles, and then you have another component, those styles won't run into each other. If you just have some global styles that are set, those will leak in, because there's nothing that it can do to stop it, because those global styles don't live in those component architectures. Whereas if it was native Shadow DOM, that would not be the case. So, but yeah, so did want to point that out. Shady DOM, very clever, works really well. Performance is not a big thing. Shadow DOM, engineering marvel, very, very slow.
And Safari 10.1 just landed in beta if you're on the OS 10s of the world and whatnots at the moment. And that has custom elements in it. So that just landed. So we're closer still. Come down the road. This is the portion where I sing about custom elements and the APIs that it travels against. So we are running up against time, though, wonderful people. Jordan, where can people find you on the web if they're looking to find you?
My Twitter and GitHub thing is lastmjs. So, and my email address is on my GitHub and stuff. So, lastmjs.
And we will put that in the show notes. And you are indeed speaking at Remote Web Components Remote Conf. You can tell it's the end of the show because I've lost the ability to speak. You are speaking there on the 16th and 17th. What's the title of your talk you're giving, by the way?
Universal Web Components.
It's going to be a good one. Danny, Leon, anything left to say to the wonderful audience out there as we sign off?
No, just go to look at webcomponents.org. Go ahead. I think it's $20 for the Web Components Remote Conf, which is nothing for 2 days with a bunch of really good stuff. Probably worth it just for that. I'm excited to see a drone powered by Web Components.
Yeah,
so
that is awesome. Just ditto what Danny said, really. Some amazing talks. You'd be ashamed if you missed it for $20.
Well, then we'll wrap it up here. So good to see everybody. And this has been episode 123 of the Web Platform Podcast. Catch us next week when we have other things to discuss about the web platform that you're using today and beyond. I'm Justin Ribeiro, signing off.
Bye, everybody.
Adios.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.